He called himself the Galloping Major, and for a while the whole country let him. The name was half a joke and half a boast, the sort of thing a man says about himself when he suspects nobody else will say it for him. And Ronald Ferguson had spent his entire life making sure people said things about him. He was tall, and he was loud. He wore the regimental tie and the cavalry twill, and the easy confidence of a man who believed he had been born to ride good horses across other people's lawns. For more than 20 years he ran the polo of the Duke of Edinburgh and then the Prince of Wales, standing at the edge of the field with a stopwatch and a clipboard, while the future King of England did more or less exactly what Major Ferguson told him to do. In the summer of 1986, his younger daughter Sarah married the Queen's second son at Westminster Abbey, and the divorced army officer with the booming voice and the wandering eye became the father-in-law of a prince. He had arrived. By every measure that mattered to him, he was finally and completely inside. Then, in the spring of 1988, a reporter from the News of the World followed him through a narrow doorway off Wigmore Street, and the inside that Ronald Ferguson had spent 40 years climbing toward began very quietly and very publicly to come apart. The Wigmore Club called itself a health club. It had a reception desk, a price list, and young women in starched white tunics who looked, for about 10 seconds, like physiotherapists. What it actually sold, according to the men who paid for it, had nothing to do with physiotherapy. The Major was a member. He was photographed going in and coming out, and when the story landed on the front page, with his daughter's married name printed beside it, he produced a defense that has outlived almost everything else he ever said in public. He had gone there for a massage, he explained, and by massage he meant a completely straight one, and the place was really just a sort of cocoon where he could shut himself away for an hour and think. The country read this and reached its own verdict. Buckingham Palace, invited to comment on the conduct of the Duke of York's father-in-law, said only that the Major would have to deal with this himself. That last line is the whole story compressed into 8 words. He would have to deal with it himself. Because the men who ran the royal household had known for years what sort of man Ronald Ferguson was. They had known it while he was managing the prince's ponies and while he was quietly steering his own daughter toward the Queen's son, long before any reporter ever stood on the pavement outside a massage parlor. There had been the first marriage that collapsed when his wife walked out and took herself to the other side of the world, and the affairs that ran alongside both of his marriages, and the young woman who would one day turn their relationship into a paperback. There had been the money troubles, the polo tournament that didn't quite add up, the lawsuits, and the bottomless, almost childlike need of the man to be standing in the middle of every photograph ever taken. The household had watched all of it and said nothing, because saying nothing was the household's first commandment, and because, for as long as the Major was useful and his daughter was royal, his secrets stayed in the category of things the institution could afford to look past. This is the story of the man the palace tolerated, and then, when he became more expensive than he was worth, the man the palace let fall. It is the story of the Galloping Major and his stopwatch, the royal bath oil that turned up as a gift in a West End massage parlor, the daughter he adored and humiliated in roughly equal measure, and the long, costly, and frequently absurd business of being the single most indiscreet man inside a family that ran on discretion. He was reckless. He was shameless, and the whole palace knew. To understand him, you have to start with the blood, because the first and most stubborn myth about Ronald Ferguson is that he was a pushy nobody who muscled his way into the orbit of the crown. He was nothing of the kind. He was born into that orbit. He came into the world in London on the 10th of October 1931. The son of Colonel Andrew Henry Ferguson, of the Life Guards, the senior regiment of the Household Cavalry, the men in the shining breastplates and plumed helmets who sit on black chargers at the sovereign's shoulder on the great state occasions. Soldiering at the very heart of the monarchy was the family trade, and his mother carried a pedigree that takes a moment to absorb properly, because it explains almost everything about the man he became. Marion Montague Douglas Scott was a daughter of one of the grandest of all the Scottish ducal houses, the House of Buccleuch. Her father, Lord Herbert Montague Douglas Scott, was a younger son of the 6th Duke of Buccleuch, and the Buccleuch line runs in an unbroken thread all the way back to King Charles II. It runs back to him, however, by a particular route, because the founder of that ducal line was James, Duke of Monmouth, the king's eldest son. Or not to a queen, but to a mistress named Lucy Walter. There is a small and perfect irony folded into that fact, and it is worth pausing on before we go a step further, because the man whose whole later life would be defined by his appetites carried in his veins the blood of the messy and most relentlessly appetite-driven monarch in the history of England, handed down through a son, conceived a long way from the marriage bed. Ronald Ferguson did not have to learn his weaknesses. He inherited them 3 centuries deep, along with the family silver. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching. From today, the grandeur did not stop with the Buccleuchs. His mother was a first cousin of Lady Alice Montague Douglas Scott, and in 1935, when Ronald was a small boy, Lady Alice married Prince Henry, the Duke of Gloucester, 3rd son of King George V. That single marriage stitched the Fergusons directly into the royal family. It made Lady Alice an aunt by marriage to the future Queen Elizabeth II, and it made Ronald, in the cool arithmetic of aristocratic kinship, a cousin of the crown. Further back still, through his father's side, he could count a Speaker of the House of Commons among his forebears. The Fergusons were not gatecrashers at the gates of the establishment. They were the establishment, or a respectable branch of it, and Ronald grew up knowing, at the level of furniture and portraits and the names of dead relations, that the people in the palaces were, in some real if distant way, his own kin. This is the key to the whole performance that followed, and it is the thing the tabloids never quite grasped when they painted him as a vulgar social climber. His confidence was not the brittle, overcompensating confidence of a man who feels he does not belong. It was the deep, unbothered confidence of a man who has never once in his life entertained the possibility. Wherever the grand people gathered, Ronald Ferguson assumed he had a chair at the table because he genuinely believed he did. That assurance charmed a great many people. It infuriated a great many others, and it carried him forward, blithe and certain, through every catastrophe he would eventually bring down on his own head, because a man who is certain he belongs does not easily imagine that he can be cast out. His early life was comfortable and rural, built around Dummerdown Farm, a handsome Queen Anne house at Dummer, near Basingstoke, in the soft green folds of Hampshire. It was the house he would one day inherit, and the house he would live and die in, and it gave him from the start the particular Englishness of the landed gentry, the world of horses and dogs and shooting, and the long, slow rhythm of country acres. There was an elder brother, John, on whom the ordinary hopes of the family had rested in the ordinary way that hopes rest on a firstborn son. John died at the age of 10 of peritonitis, in the years before antibiotics made such a death almost unthinkable, and so Ronald, the second son, became the only son, the one who would carry the name, the boy whose survival now mattered more than anyone had planned for it to. Children who become only children through the death of a sibling often grow up carrying a strange double burden, the sense of being both irreplaceable and somehow standing in for someone else. Whether it marked him is impossible to say. He was not a man given to looking inward, and he left very little record of his own interior weather. But the fact sits there at the start of his life, quiet and heavy, and it is worth noting before we move on. He was educated along the standard production line for the sons of cavalry officers. First Ludgrove, the preparatory school in Berkshire that would much later educate his own grandsons. Then Eton, the great school across the river from Windsor Castle that has supplied the English ruling class with its leaders, its prime ministers, and a remarkable proportion of its scoundrels for the better part of 5 centuries. Then the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, where the army takes the well-bred young man and turns him into an officer. And in February 1952, at the age of 20, Ronald Ferguson was commissioned to the Guards, the same regiment in which his father had served, the regiment that rides closest of all to the throne. He took to soldiering the way he took to nearly everything, with enormous physical energy and a complete untroubled confidence in his own judgment. The household cavalry suited his temperament exactly, because it is a world organized at its ceremonial heart around appearance. It is about getting the uniform precisely right, sitting the horse precisely straight, holding the line, holding the composure, and performing a role in front of a watching public without ever letting the mask slip. There is real soldiering underneath it, and Ferguson did that too, serving with the regiment in Germany during the long cold standoff of the early Cold War, and in Egypt and in Aden, and in Cyprus in the years when the British Army was managing the awkward, often bloody business of letting an empire go. He was promoted lieutenant in 1954 and captain in 1958. He was, by the accounts that survive, a competent and popular officer, the kind men were glad to serve alongside. But the lasting thing the lifeguards taught him was not tactics. It was the lesson that would shape every year of the half-century that followed, which was that an enormous amount can be accomplished in this world simply by looking like the sort of man to whom things are owed. Stand straight, speak as though you expect to be obeyed, wear the right tie, ride the right horse, and a great deal will be handed to you without your ever having to ask. Ronald Ferguson absorbed that lesson completely, and he never let go of it. Long after the breastplate and the plumed helmet were folded away, he went on being a cavalry officer in his bearing, his voice, and his bottomless assumption of his own importance. He spent the rest of his life looking the part, and for a long time, looking the part was enough. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment to subscribe and tap the bell, and tell me down in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely like to know who I'm talking to. In January 1956, at St. Margaret's, Westminster, the elegant church that stands in the shadow of the Abbey and serves as the parish church of the House of Commons, Captain Ronald Ferguson married Susan Mary Wright. She was 18 years old. She had been born in 1937 at Bramcote in Nottinghamshire, the daughter of Fitzherbert Wright, a man who had made a serious fortune in the steel industry, and of the Honourable Doreen Wingfield, a niece of Viscount Powerscourt, whose family seat in County Wicklow was one of the great houses of Ireland. Susan, in other words, came from money on one side and old aristocracy on the other, and she belonged to that small, interlocking, endlessly intermarried world of débutantes and country weekends and the London season, where everyone of consequence already knew everyone else of consequence and had done for generations. There is one detail from Susan's girlhood that looks utterly trivial and turns out to be one of the load-bearing facts of this entire story. Among her friends as a young woman was another girl named Frances Roche. Frances would grow up to marry Earl Spencer and to become the mother of Lady Diana Spencer. The friendship between Susan Wright and Frances Roche, formed when they were teenagers, would be handed down a whole generation, so that decades later their two daughters, Sarah Ferguson and Diana Spencer, would find one another and become close, and it would be Diana, in time, who quietly steered Sarah toward the royal family. The most consequential female friendship in the modern history of the monarchy was seated in a circle of well-bred girls in the 1950s. Ronald Ferguson had absolutely nothing to do with arranging it. He simply married into a family that was already woven, by friendship and blood, into the future of the crown, and then, as he did with so many things, took the eventual credit as if it had been his own design. The early years of the marriage were, by the accounts that survive, genuinely happy. The young Fergusons were recognized society figures, both good-looking, both energetic, a fixture of the right parties and the right race meetings. And they had two daughters. Jane Louisa arrived in August 1957. Sarah Margaret, the one the whole world would eventually come to know, arrived in October 1959. For a while the picture was complete. A handsome cavalry captain, a pretty young wife, two little girls, a future in the green Hampshire countryside. Then two things happened, close together, that set the rest of his life in motion. In 1968 his father died. Ronald retired from the army with the honorary rank of major, the rank that would supply his enduring nickname for the rest of his days, and he inherited Dummerdown Farm and moved his young family there, out of the rhythms of regimental life and into the role of a Hampshire landowner. And with the soldiering behind him and time on his hands and a farm to run, the thing that had until then been a passion became an obsession. Polo took over his life entirely, and it never let go. He had played as an officer the way cavalrymen did, because the household cavalry and the polo field have always belonged to the same world. Now he gave himself to the game completely. He played, and then he began to organize, and then he began to manage, and the sport pulled him steadily and irresistibly into the orbit of the royal family. Because the royal men of his era played polo too, and a man who could run a polo operation well was a useful man to have around. Polo became the engine of his entire identity, the thing he understood, the thing he was genuinely good at, and the ladder by which he climbed toward the center of things. The trouble as far as his marriage was concerned was that polo is an unfaithful sort of devotion in its own right. It takes a man away. It took Ronald Ferguson to tournaments and matches and the endless traveling social circuit that surrounds the sport, and it kept him away from Dummer for long stretches at a time. And somewhere in those years of absence, the pattern established itself that would define the man for the rest of his life. He was unfaithful to his wife. The detail that did the most damage, the one Susan never forgave and never forgot, was that one of the women involved was a close friend of her own. He would later offer the standard accounting that unfaithful men of his class always seem to offer, conceding to nothing worse than the occasional indiscretion. A couple of brief affairs across 16 years of marriage, and denying everything beyond that. His wife had a different version, and her version was the one that counted, because she was the one who, in the end, walked out the door. The end came in 1972. The Fergusons took a family holiday to the Greek island of Corfu, and on that holiday, Susan met an Argentine player named Hector Barantz. Barantz was, by any measure, a remarkable man. He had been a star rugby player and a Golden Gloves heavyweight boxer before he became one of the finest horsemen of his generation. And at the precise moment Susan met him, he was also a man in fresh and terrible grief. Earlier that same year, his first wife, who had been pregnant, had been killed in a car crash near Buenos Aires. Two people met on that Greek island, then, both of them carrying something broken, and they recognized something in one another. And that recognition changed the course of half a dozen lives. By the end of the summer, Susan had made the decision that would brand her for the rest of her days in the small and pitiless world she had grown up. She left. She left Ronald, and she left England, and most painfully of all, she left her two daughters, who were then 15 and 12, and she went to live with Hector Barantz on a ranch in Argentina, 350 miles southwest of Buenos Aires. A great spread called El Pucará, where the two of them would breed polo ponies by the hundred and raise cattle and build, on the far side of the world, the life she had decided she wanted more than the one she already had. The divorce came through in May 1974. She married Barantz in 1975, and the society she had left behind reached, with its usual cruelty, for the word it kept ready for women who did this. They called her the bolter. Here is the part of the story that the later chapters tend to flatten, and it deserves to be stated as plainly as possible, because it is the one genuinely sympathetic thing about the man at this stage of his life. Whatever Ronald Ferguson's faults, and they were already considerable, in the summer of 1972, he became a single father. The two girls were not allowed to go to Argentina. There was never any question of it. They stayed at Dummer and were raised by their father, with the help of the wider family, while their mother built her new life on another continent and saw them only on the visits that could be arranged across an ocean. And one of the daughters in particular, the younger ones, Sarah, carried the wound of that abandonment for the rest of her life, the specific unhealing ache of a child who learns at the age of 12 that her mother has chosen somewhere else and someone else over her. There is a symmetry here so neat that it would be rejected as too tidy if a novelist proposed it, and it links this story to the larger royal tragedy that ran alongside it. Sarah's eventual closest friend, the woman who would draw her into the royal family, was Diana Spencer, and Diana's mother, Frances, the very same Frances Roche who had been Susan's friend at school, had also left her family, also for another man, when Diana was small. The two girls who would one day stand together at the dead center of the House of Windsor. The two most photographed young women in the world had both been in the cold shorthand of the period, daughters of bolters. They understood one another at a depth most people never reach with anyone, because they had survived the identical wound in childhood. It is one of the quiet engines underneath the whole saga, and it began with two teenage girls who were friends in the 1950s and grew up to lose their mothers in almost exactly the same way. There is one further thread to touch, lightly and carefully, because it has circulated for years, and because it ties this man's story to a far more famous one. Susan Barantes, after she became part of the extended royal scene through her daughter's marriage, became the subject of a persistent piece of gossip set down most prominently in a recent biography by the historian Andrew Lowney, holding that she had at some point been romantically involved with Prince Philip. The claim has never been substantiated. There is no proof of it, only a long friendship between the two and the eagerness of the age to read the worst into any such friendship, and it belongs in the same locked drawer as every other unprovable royal rumor of the era. It is mentioned here at all only because it captures the atmosphere in which Ronald Ferguson moved, a hothouse world where everyone seemed to be entangled with everyone, where the gossip never quite died, and where the Major, for all his eventual notoriety, was very far from the only person in the picture with secrets the palace would have preferred to keep buried. What it left him with in 1974 was a divorce, two daughters to raise, and a wound to his pride that the public version of events did very little to soothe. Because the public version, the version that suited him, was that he was the wronged party, the loyal husband abandoned by a flighty wife who ran off to South America with a polo player. That version was not entirely false. Susan did leave, and she did run off with Barantes, and the abandonment of the children was real and lasting. But it was also a version that quietly buried the years of his own infidelity, including the affair with his wife's friend, the appetites and absences that had hollowed the marriage out long before that holiday in Corfu. Ronald Ferguson would spend the rest of his life telling stories in which he was the injured man, and other people were the cause of his troubles, and the divorce was the first great occasion on which he got to perform that role. It would not be the last. It was, if anything, only the dress rehearsal. Within about a year of the divorce, he married again. His second wife was Susan Rosemary Deptford, and she would turn out to be the most quietly heroic figure in the whole of his story. They married in 1975, and they had 3 children together over the following decade. Andrew arrived in 1978, Alice in 1980, and Eliza in 1985. Where the first marriage had collapsed in betrayal and flight, the second one held, and it held through things that would have ended almost any marriage on earth. Susan Deptford stayed. She stayed through the polo and the absences, and she stayed much later through the front-page humiliations that were still years off, the massage parlor and the mistress and the books and the lawsuits. She was still his wife on the day he died. The Galloping Major, a man who had treated fidelity as a sort of optional accessory throughout his first marriage, was somehow granted a second wife who simply declined to be driven away, who held her ground through every storm he generated and went on holding it for the rest of his life. It is one of the very few unmixed pieces of good fortune the man ever enjoyed, and there is no evidence anywhere that he understood the scale of it. There is a version of Ronald Ferguson that the front pages never showed, and it is worth conjuring it, because it complicates the cartoon, and because it was, in its own quiet way, just as real as the cartoon. It is the version that lived at Dummer Down Farm, in the soft Hampshire countryside, away from the cameras and the polo marquees and the Sunday tabloids. There, behind the gates that the photographers would one day besiege, was an ordinary, comfortable, slightly shabby country life, the kind the English landed gentry have lived for centuries. There were the farm and its routines, the early mornings, the dogs underfoot, the horses in the fields, the long, unhurried rhythm of a man pottering about his own acres. There was the handsome old Queen Anne house, full of the accumulated clutter of a family. And there was the second family, the 3 younger children, Andrew and Alice and Eliza, growing up in the 1980s and 1990s in the strange position of being the much younger half-siblings of a duchess, the ordinary children of a Hampshire farm, who happened to be related, through their famous half-sister, to the future king. At the center of all of it was Susan Deptford, and the more you understand about what she endured and how she endured it, the more remarkable she becomes. She was, by every account, the steady hand on the household, the quiet, sensible, unflappable counterweight to her husband's noise and chaos. While the Major thundered about the place, generating headlines and humiliation and the occasional scandal, Susan kept the home running, raised the children, ran the farm's domestic life, and absorbed, with a composure that must have cost her a great deal, the public disgraces that her husband kept bringing down on the family. She did not leave when the Wigmore Club broke. She did not leave when the Leslie Players affair was exposed, an affair in which her own husband had pursued a younger woman with what that woman called an obsessive love. She stayed through it all, for nearly 30 years, and she was still there at the end. There are women, the records of these things suggest, who simply decide, early and finally, what kind of marriage they are going to have, and what they are prepared to absorb to keep it, and who then hold to that decision with a steadiness that the people around them find almost incomprehensible. Susan Deptford appears to have been one of them. Whatever private accounting she made, whatever she decided she could live with, and what she decided to overlook, she made it once and she kept to it, and her loyalty is one of the genuinely admirable things in a story that does not contain a great many of them. The contrast between the two Fergusons, the public one and the domestic one, is the kind of contrast that runs through a great many lives, but was unusually sharp in his. The public Major was the bombastic, scandal-prone figure of the front pages, the man from the massage parlor, the embarrassment to the crown. The domestic Major, by the accounts of those who knew the family at home, was a quieter and gentler figure. A man genuinely devoted to his children and his farm and his dogs and his horses, happiest, perhaps, in an old coat on a cold morning with mud on his boots, far from the marquees and the cameras, and the whole exhausting performance of being the Galloping Major. It would be too simple and almost certainly untrue to say that the domestic man was the real one and the public man the act. The truth is that both were real, and both were him, the loud and the quiet, the reckless and the homely, the man who could not stop talking in public, and the man who pottered about his fields in private. He contained both, as most people contain their own contradictions, except that in his case the contradiction was lived out on a national stage, the squalid headlines and the ordinary country life running side by side, year after year, while the press showed the country only ever one of them. His love of the country was deep and old and entirely genuine, the one steady thread, along with the polo and the children, that ran unbroken through the whole turbulent length of his life. He had grown up at Dummer, and he would die a few miles from it, and in between, whatever else he was doing, whatever scandal he was generating, the farm and the Hampshire fields remained the place he came back to, the fixed point around which the chaos turned. There is something almost poignant in the thought of it. The man who spent so much of his energy trying to be at the center of the grandest world in the country, the world of princes and palaces and royal polo, finding his deepest and most reliable contentment in the most ordinary place imaginable, a working farm in the English countryside, with his second wife keeping the home steady and his children growing up around him and his dogs at his feet. He wanted the palace. He was happiest in the end, in the mud. It is the kind of contradiction that defined him, and it is the kind that, once you notice it, makes him a great deal harder to dismiss as a mere buffoon. With the second marriage settled, the children arriving, and the farm at Dummer as his base, Ronald Ferguson built the career that made his name, and gave him the place in the world he had been moving toward since boyhood. He became polo manager, first to the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, and then, for around 21 years, to the Prince of Wales. It is worth being precise about the nature of the job, because the precise nature of it mattered enormously to the way he understood himself. It was unpaid. That single fact was, to a man of his background, the whole point. An unpaid manager is not a tradesman or an employee or hired help. He is a gentleman, generously volunteering his time and his expertise in the service of the heir to the throne, which is an altogether grander and more flattering thing to be, and which placed Ferguson, in his own mind, not below the prince as a servant but beside him as a useful and trusted companion. The work itself was real, and this is the part that the scandals would later bury so completely that people forgot it had ever been true. He ran the prince's polo at the Guards' Polo Club at Smith's Lawn, in Windsor Great Park, the most prestigious polo ground in the country, set in the green expanse below Windsor Castle. He rose to be the club's deputy chairman. He arranged the fixtures, managed the grounds, handled the players and the ponies, and the schedules and the thousand small logistics that have to come together to put a high-goal match on a field. And he did it well, with the organizing energy of a former cavalry officer and a genuine, lifelong love of the game. He was decisive and tireless, and he knew the sport inside out, and the Prince of Wales relied on him, year after year, for 2 decades. Whatever else he was, in this one domain he was good at his job, and the job mattered. He could play too, and play seriously. In 1979, he was a member of the England 2 team alongside the Prince of Wales himself and 2 other players that won the Silver Jubilee Cup. He played competitively for more than 40 years, in something like 16 different countries, carrying his game to India and Zambia and Cyprus and Finland and wherever else the international polo circuit took him. That is a remarkable record for any amateur, and it was not a pose. Polo was the real center of Ronald Ferguson, the one thing in his life that was wholly genuine, neither performed nor exaggerated nor mixed up with vanity, the thing he simply loved and was simply good at. And it was the ladder by which he climbed, and the ladder by which his daughter climbed after him. It is worth lingering for a moment on what the job of polo manager actually involved, because the title sounds a good deal grander and bigger than the work, and the work tells you something true about the man underneath the bluster. The polo season in England runs through the summer, and at Smith's Lawn, in the great green sweep of Windsor Great Park below the castle, it was, in those years, the most important fixture of all. Running it meant 1,000 unglamorous things. It meant arranging the fixtures and the teams and the handicaps. It meant liaising with the grooms and the players and the visiting patrons. It meant managing the ponies, dozens of them, the strings of horses that a single high-goal match consumes, each one ridden hard for a chukka and then swapped out for a fresh mount. It meant the sponsors, the men with money who paid for the privilege of having their company's name on a tournament, and who had to be flattered and managed and kept happy. And above all, it meant fitting the whole enormous, expensive, delicate machine around the diary of the heir to the throne, who was a busy man with a great many other calls on his time, and who wanted, when he did come to play, for everything to be exactly right. Ronald Ferguson made it exactly right. He was good at it, genuinely and demonstrably good, with the organizing instinct of a former cavalry officer who had spent years making sure that men and horses turned up in the correct place at correct time in the correct order. He was decisive. He did not dither. He knew the game inside out, the tactics of it and the logistics of it both, and he ran the operation with a brisk, barking, parade ground authority that left no one in any doubt about who was in charge. And there, on the edge of the field, with his stopwatch in one hand and his clipboard in the other, was the spectacle that captures him better than almost anything else. A retired major, a man of no particular rank in the wider world, standing on the grass and issuing instructions to the future King of England as though the prince were a subaltern who had turned up late for muster. Charles, by every account, accepted it, because Charles wanted to win, and Ferguson helped him win, and because there's a certain kind of confident, capable, slightly overbearing man whom even princes are happy to be bossed around by on the narrow ground of his own expertise. On the polo field, the major outranked the prince, and both of them knew it, and that small, strange inversion of the natural order of things was the source of a great deal of Ronald Ferguson's happiness. The polo set was its own world, a glittering, sun-browned, horse-mad society of patrons and players and grooms and hangers-on, of titled amateurs and hard-bitten Argentine professionals, of rich men buying their way onto good teams and beautiful women drifting about the boundary in summer dresses. It was a world that suited him perfectly because it ran on exactly the currency he dealt in, which was a combination of social grandeur, physical confidence, and the easy assumption that everyone present belonged to a charmed and superior tribe. He was a fixture of it for decades, and opinion within it was divided about him in a way that would prove prophetic. Some people loved him. They found him warm, funny, generous, marvelous company, a man who lit up a marquee and told a good story and treated the grooms and the duchesses with the same booming bonhomie. Others him insufferable, a pompous, self-important windbag who took the credit for everything and the blame for nothing, who name-dropped the prince at every opportunity, and who carried himself as though the entire sport revolved around his own indispensable person. Both camps were describing the same man. He was, depending on the angle and the day, either the best company at the party or the most exhausting man in the room, and quite often he managed to be both within the same hour. The nickname, the Galloping Major, fitted him so well that it has very nearly swallowed his actual name, and it captured the slightly comic, slightly theatrical quality of the figure he cut, the bluff cavalryman thundering about the place, full of energy and opinion and self-regard. He looked the part to the very last detail, the regimental ties, the well-cut country clothes, the polished brogues, the upright bearing of a man who had spent his formative years being taught to sit a horse and hold a line. He was, in the most literal sense, a professional gentleman, a man whose entire stock in trade was the appearance and manner of a certain kind of well-bred Englishman, and he traded on it for the whole of his adult life. And underneath the performance, in this one domain at least, there was real substance. He was not merely playing at being a polo manager. He could actually do the job and do it well, for one of the most demanding employers in the country, year after year, for 2 decades. It is the single most important thing to hold on to about him, because everything that came later, all the scandal and the squalor and the self-inflicted ruin, has a way of obscuring it. Before he was a punchline, Ronald Ferguson was good at something difficult, and the man whose polo he ran knew it, which is why, long after the rest of the institution had cut him loose, it was the prince who quietly let him back in at the end. By the early 1980s, he had become a recognizable national character, the Galloping Major, booming and blunt and convivial, a fixture of the polo set, and a sort of unofficial courtier of the horse world. He was the kind of man newspapers liked, because he said quotable things and looked the part and could be relied upon to provide color. And he was, in his own settled estimation, exactly where he was meant to be, at the right hand of the future king, at the center of the grandest sporting world in the country, a Hampshire squire with royal blood and a royal patron, and a comfortable sense that his life had arranged itself precisely as it ought to have done. Then his daughter married a prince, and the comfortable arrangement became something far larger and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The story of how Sarah Ferguson came to marry Prince Andrew has been told many times, and the short version is that Polo and Diana managed it between them. The families had been circling one another for years through the horse and polo world, those overlapping county circles where the same few hundred people meet again and again across a lifetime. And the friendship between Sarah and Diana, that inherited bond reaching back to their mother's schoolty days, did the rest. In June 1985, during the week of Royal Ascot, Diana, by now the Princess of Wales and the most famous woman in the world, made sure that Sarah was added to the guest list of a party the Queen was hosting at Windsor, and Sarah and Andrew were seated next to each other at lunch. Andrew was the Queen's second son, a Falklands War helicopter pilot, handsome and boisterous, and the nearest thing the royal family possessed to a normal, red-blooded young man about town. He and Sarah, 2 large and laughing personalities, fell for one another fast. They married on the 23rd of July 1986 at Westminster Abbey, in front of a worldwide television audience numbered in the hundreds of millions. Sarah Ferguson became Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of York, and the country, which had grown perhaps a little weary of Diana's fragile perfection, took to this new arrival at once, this cheerful, freckled, slightly chaotic, red-haired young woman who laughed too loudly and seemed so much warmer and more human than the rest of the cool, careful family she had joined. For a brief season, Fergie, as the papers christened her with instant affection, was the most popular member of the House of Windsor. And Ronald Ferguson, the divorced major from a Hampshire farm, the single father, the polo manager, the man with the Stuart blood and the royal patron and the lifelong assumption of his own belonging, stood in Westminster Abbey as the father of the bride and watched his daughter marry into the family he had been circling his entire life. It was the summit. Everything he had ever quietly believed about his own place in the order of things had just been confirmed in the grandest possible setting in front of the whole world, with the Queen and her family looking on. He had not merely arrived. His blood was now mingled, through his daughter and the children she would bear, with the blood of the reigning house itself. His grandchildren would be princesses. There was, in that summer of 1986, no higher place for a man like him to reach. He should have stopped there. He should have settled into the comfortable role of the proud, faintly ridiculous patriarch, and grown old with his dignity intact at Dummer. But dignity was never Ronald Ferguson's strong suit, and the most reliable feature of his entire character was a near-total inability to leave well. Enough alone. The higher he had climbed, the further he now had to fall, and the fall, when it came fast. Before we go on, if this story is holding your attention, do take a second to subscribe and leave a comment telling me what you make of the Major so far. It helps the channel more than you might think, and I read them. It was 1988. Sarah was the Duchess of York, married less than 2 years, the most talked-about woman in Britain, and that summer she would give birth to her first child, Princess Beatrice. The whole Ferguson clan had never been more visible or more fortunate, and the Major himself had never been more pleased with the way the world had treated him. And it was at this exact moment, at the high water mark of the family's fortunes, that a journalist from the News of the World, the largest and most ruthless of the Sunday tabloids, followed Major Ronald Ferguson to a doorway in central London, and the most famous scandal of his life went off across the front pages like a bomb. The Wigmore Club, off Wigmore Street near the smart medical district of Harley Street, presented itself to the world as a health club. It had, in the newspaper's account, the trappings of respectability, a reception, a tariff, an air of brisk professionalism, and it was staffed by young women who wore starched white gowns of a vaguely medical cut, the kind of thing a physiotherapist might wear, who offered, according to the paper, rather more than the advertised massage. The phrase the newspaper used was à la carte, and it is a small marvel of insinuation, 2 French words doing the work of an entire paragraph, conjuring a menu of services from which a member might choose. Major Ferguson was a member. He had been photographed entering and leaving, and the story ran in precisely the manner you would expect a story to run, when it can fasten the words royal, massage parlor, and father-in-law of the Duke of York to a single headline. It ran enormous. It ran for days. It ran on both sides of the Atlantic, where the American papers, unbothered by Britain's libel laws and unworried about offending the palace, could be a good deal blunter than the British ones. What lifted the whole sorry business out of mere squalor and into something close to farce was the defense the Major offered, which has survived in the record, precisely because it is so gloriously, immortally useless. He had gone to the club only for a massage, he insisted, and by massage he meant, in his own carefully chosen words, a totally straight one. And the place, he went on, was really nothing more than a kind of cocoon, somewhere he could shut himself away for an hour and think. Set aside, for one moment, the obvious difficulty with this account as a literal description of events. Consider only the self-portrait he chose to present to the British public in his own defense. Here was a 56-year-old retired officer of the Household Cavalry, polo manager to the future King of England, grandfather of a princess due to be born that summer, explaining that he visited a Wigmore Street massage parlor in order to enjoy a quiet think. It is, by some distance, the most expensive hour of contemplation in the recorded history of London. One pictures the Major, robed and reclining, retreating into his cocoon to ponder the great questions of the day while the meter ran. And there was a final detail, the sort of thing a novelist would be too embarrassed to invent for fear of overdoing it. which was that the perfume and the bath oil he handed out to the young women, as little gifts, were said to be the very same brands used by the royal family. The toiletries of the House of Windsor, distributed as party favors in a West End knocking shop. It is hard to think of a single image that more perfectly captures the gap between what Ronald Ferguson believed himself to be and what he had actually become. The grand connection, the royal proximity, the thing he prized above all else, reduced to a bottle of the Queen's bath oil left behind on a massage table off Wigmore Street. You could not make it up. The country did not have to. It was all there, in the paper on a Sunday. What followed was the particular kind of feeding frenzy that the British press of the late 1980s did better and more mercilessly than any press in the world. One Sunday tabloid had the story, and by Monday morning, every other paper in the country was chasing it, and by the middle of the week the pack of photographers had taken up its position at the end of the drive at Dummer, the long lenses trained on the farmhouse, waiting for a glimpse of the Major coming or going. There is a grim ritual to these things, and Ronald Ferguson was now living through it from the wrong side. The doorstepping, the reporters calling the house at all hours, the neighbors and the acquaintances, and the people who had played a chucka with him, once being offered money for a quote, the slow, total conversion of a private man into public property, his name and his face and his folly now belonging to everyone, to be picked over at every breakfast table in the land. He had spent his life wanting to be famous, in the comfortable, flattering way that a polo grandee is famous within his own world. Now he was famous in the other way, the way that strips a man bare, and he discovered, as everyone discovers who experiences both, that they are not remotely the same thing. He tried for a while to brazen it out, which was the only strategy his temperament allowed, because retreat and silence were as foreign to him as flight is to a man with no wings. He gave his explanations, he offered his cocoon and his straight massage, and his quiet hour of thinking. He insisted on his innocence in the particular, even as the general picture grew steadily more damning. And the more he talked, the worse it became, because every fresh quotation gave the story another day of life, and the press could hardly believe its good fortune in finding a subject so constitutionally unable to stop digging. A wiser man, or simply a quieter one, might have said nothing at all, issued a single terse statement, and then vanished from view until the storm blew itself out. Ronald Ferguson could no more have done that than he could have flown to the moon. He had to explain, he had to defend himself, he had to be heard, and so he fed the very fire that was consuming him day after day, with the same heedless openness that had got him into the curtained room in the first place. The cruelty of the timing was almost unbearable, and it fell not on him but on his daughter, because 1988 was the year Sarah gave birth to her first child, Princess Beatrice, who arrived that August, and so the scandal of the father broke over the family. At the precise moment the daughter was at her most exposed and most vulnerable, a young woman becoming a mother for the first time inside the goldfish bowl of the royal family, with the whole world watching. The newest and most popular member of the House of Windsor, the cheerful redhead the country had taken to its heart only 2 years before, now had to carry her pregnancy and her new motherhood through a season in which her own Tudor father was splashed across the front pages over a massage parlor scandal. Whatever the Major told himself about his innocence and his quiet hour of contemplation, the practical effect of his behavior was to humiliate his daughter at the most tender moment of her young life, and to do it in public, in front of the family she had so recently and so anxiously joined. There is no doubt that he loved her, and he had, through his own recklessness, handed the press a stick with which to beat her at the worst possible moment, and he appears never to have fully reckoned with what that cost her. It became very quickly a national joke, and there is a particular indignity in becoming a national joke that is worse in some ways than becoming a national villain. A villain at least retains a certain dark dignity, a joke retains none. The comedians worked the Major into their routines, the cartoonists drew him. The phrase "the Wigmore Club" entered the language as a kind of shorthand, a knowing wink, a thing you could refer to across a dinner table and be sure everyone understood. Ronald Ferguson, who had wanted above all things to be a figure of consequence, a man taken seriously in serious rooms, had become instead a figure of fun. The bumbling old major, caught with his metaphorical trousers round his ankles, and the country laughed at him with that mixture of mockery and faint, exasperated affection that the British reserve for the more harmless variety of public fool. He would carry that role for the rest of his life. Whatever else he did, whatever good he later managed, he was, from the spring of 1988 onward, the man from the massage parlor, and no amount of brazening it out was ever going to change that. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. And through all of it, the silence from the palace was total and deliberate. And the contrast between his noise and their silence told the whole story of where each party stood. He talked and talked and talked, explaining, defending, protesting. They said nothing beyond the single glacial sentence about his dealing with it himself. He filled the airwaves with his own voice because he did not know how to do anything else, and they withdrew into the institutional silence that is the royal family's most reliable weapon, the silence that says, more eloquently than any statement could, that this is not our affair, that this man's is not our concern, that whatever he is not us. It was the first time the gap between them had been made visible to the whole country, the gap between the loud, exposed, self-incriminating major and the cold, contained, untouchable institution he had spent his life trying to join. It would not be the last, but it was the clearest, and it set the pattern for everything that followed. The man who could not stop talking, standing alone in the rain, outside the gates of the family that had perfected the art of saying nothing at all. Ferguson said, in the end, the only true thing available to him, which was that he had been a fool. And then he waited, because the waiting was the part that actually mattered. The question was never really whether the public would forgive him. The public, on the whole, found the whole thing more comic than scandalous, an old buffer caught with his trousers metaphorically down. And there was even a certain rough affection in the mockery. The question that mattered was what the palace would do, because Ronald Ferguson's entire standing in life, his whole sense of who he was, rested on the royal family's willingness to keep him close. He was waiting to find out whether he was still one of them. The palace's answer was a single sentence, and it was delivered with the cold, surgical precision the institution keeps in reserve for exactly these moments. Buckingham Palace let it be known that the major would have to deal with this himself. That was all. There was no statement of support. There was no expression of continued confidence. There was no warm word about a valued friend going through a difficult time. There was only the quiet, devastating clarity of an ancient institution taking one step back and leaving a man to stand alone in the rain. To anyone who knew how the household worked, that one sentence said everything. It said that he was not, and never quite had been, one of them. It said that his usefulness had run its course. It said, go and clean up your own mess. And do not imagine that the warmth you have enjoyed for all these years was ever anything other than conditional. And then the consequences arrived, swiftly and without sentiment. He lost his position as polo manager to the Prince of Wales, the role that had defined him for 2 decades, and that had been the proudest fact of his public life. And he lost his place at the Guards' Polo Club at Smith's Lawn, which was, after all, the prince's own ground, the very heart of royal polo. The reasoning required no explanation, because everyone understood it instantly. A man simply could not run the heir to the throne's polo, while his name sat on the front pages, week after week, attached to a massage parlour scandal. The embarrassment was intolerable. The center had to be protected, and protecting the center meant cutting loose the periphery. And Ronald Ferguson, for all his blood and all his service and all his royal connections, had just discovered which of those 2 categories he belonged to. He retreated. He withdrew to the Royal Berkshire Polo Club, a club he had himself helped to establish, where he could go on being a grandee of the polo world in somewhat reduced and less exalted circumstances, no longer at the prince's side at Smith's Lawn, but still at least on a polo field, still organizing, still important within his own diminished kingdom. It was a soft landing of a sort. It was not the grand prize, and everyone, the Major most of all, knew the difference. Susan Deptford, true to the unbreakable form of her entire married life, stayed exactly where she was. The marriage survived the Wigmore Club without any apparent crisis at all, which tells you a great deal about the depth of her patience and possibly about how very little she had ever expected of him in the first place. The deepest truth of the Wigmore affair is not the seediness of it, which was ordinary enough, the commonplace folly of a vain middle-aged man. The deepest truth is what the whole episode laid bare about the family Ferguson had spent his life trying to join, and about the terms on which it had been letting him stand near it. The palace had known. They had known for years what kind of man he was, through the wreck of his first marriage and the affairs, and the general air about him, of a man who could not be trusted within reach of temptation of any kind. And they had said nothing, because for as long as he was useful, his private appetites were a private matter, beneath the institution's notice. The very instant he became a public liability, the calculation flipped, silently and completely. The institution does not punish in the way an angry person punishes, it simply withdraws. It takes one step back, lets go, and allows the cold air to do the rest. And the man who had stood in Westminster Abbey 2 years earlier as the beaming father of the bride, certain at last of his place, discovered in the spring of 1988 that the place had always been on loan, and that the single condition of the loan was that he must never, under any circumstances, become an embarrassment to the crown. He had become an embarrassment. He would have to deal with it himself. If the Wigmore Club had been the end of it, Ronald Ferguson might still have recovered some portion of his dignity, settled into the role of the chastened old patriarch, and grown old quietly among his horses at Dummer. He did not, and the reason he did not is the single most extraordinary feature of his entire character, which was an apparently total, almost magnificent inability to learn anything at all from catastrophe. The massage parlor was not the bottom. It was barely the beginning. Within a few short years, he would be standing at the center of a second scandal. That was, in its own way, more damaging than the first, because this time it would not be a sordid transaction with a stranger in a curtained room, but a genuine entanglement, a real and reckless love affair with a woman young enough to be his daughter, conducted in plain sight against the most lurid possible backdrop, which was his own daughter's marriage collapsing in flames in front of the entire world. Her name was Leslie Player. She was a South African by background, energetic and ambitious, and drawn to the glittering world of international polo, and in 1990, she organized what was billed as the first ever women's polo tournament, an event that pulled her into the orbit of the people who ran the sport, and from there, inevitably, into the orbit of Ronald Ferguson. The Major took an interest. The interest became something a great deal more than professional, and, by Leslie Player's own later account, the title of which leaves very little to the imagination. She became the object of what she described as an obsessive love from the father of the VM, Duchess of York. He pursued her, he wrote to her, he arranged to be where she was. He behaved, in short, like a man who had decided that the ordinary rules of caution did not apply to him, which was the way Ronald Ferguson had behaved his entire life, except that now he was doing it at the very moment when every newspaper in the country was watching his family, with the unblinking attention of a hawk over a field. To grasp how reckless this was, you have to hold the timing in your mind. By 1990, the Wigmore Club was only 2 years in the past. The Ferguson name was radioactive. Every reporter in Fleet Street knew exactly who the Major was, and exactly what he had already cost the palace once, and any one of them would have given a month's salary for evidence of a fresh scandal attached to the same family. A sensible man in that position, a man with even an ounce of instinct for self-preservation, would have spent the early 1990s being as invisible and as blameless as it was possible for a human being to be. Ronald Ferguson conducted an affair with a much younger woman who was deeply embedded in the polo world and who would, when it all fell apart, write a book about it. He could not help himself. The phrase recurs throughout his life because it is the only phrase that fits. He simply could not help himself. The women's polo enterprise that had brought the two of them together came wrapped in its own difficulties, And those difficulties added a layer of grubbiness to a situation that was already grubby enough. Elite international polo floats on an ocean of money that comes from some of the richest people on earth, the kind of sponsorship that arrives from oil sheikhs and sultans and billionaires, for whom a polo tournament is a pleasant way to spend a few £100,000. The women's events moved in exactly that world, and where that kind of money moves, questions about where it has all gone are never very far behind. There were accusations of financial irregularity, of sums that did not reconcile, of money that seemed to have gone astray somewhere between the sponsors and the events. No criminal charges were ever brought, and the precise truth of who had mishandled what was never established in any court of law. But the smell of it lingered, and it attached itself to the Major along with everything else. The suggestion that wherever Ronald Ferguson was involved, the books had a way of becoming difficult to follow. For Leslie Player herself, the entire adventure ended in personal and financial ruin, which was, by this point in the story, more or less the standard fate awaiting anyone who got too close to this family in this particular decade. And here is where the father's story and the daughter's stories stop running on parallel tracks and braid together into a single tangled rope, because the cast of characters overlapped in a way that no scriptwriter would dare to submit, for fear of being told it strained credulity past breaking point. When Leslie Player finally told her story in a book, the book was not titled simply with her own name and the Major's. It was titled with admirable commercial clarity to signal that it concerned the Duchess of York, her father, and the author herself, and it told not only of her affair with Ronald Ferguson, but of her encounters with two other men, two Americans, who sat at the dead center of Sarah's own unfolding catastrophe. Their names were Steve Wyatt and John Bryan. To understand why their appearance in the Major's mistress's book was so extraordinary, you have to understand what those two men were doing to the Duchess of York at the very same time. Steve Wyatt was a wealthy and good-looking Texan, the kind of charming, attentive, faintly exotic American who turns the head of an unhappy woman who feels neglected by her own husband. And Sarah, by the end of the 1980s, was a deeply unhappy woman who felt neglected by her own husband. Prince Andrew was a serving naval officer, and the Navy kept him at sea for long stretches, leaving his young, gregarious, attention-hungry wife alone for months at a time. Sarah would say later, with a bitterness that had clearly never fully healed, that she had married a man who happened to be a prince and a naval officer, and that what she had actually got was the palace without the man, that across an entire year of her marriage, she saw her husband for something like 40 days. Into that loneliness in 1989 came Steve Wyatt, whom she met in Houston, and the friendship between them became, by the accounts of several later books, something a good deal warmer than friendship. The relationship detonated in January 1992, when photographs surfaced of Wyatt with the infant Princess Beatrice, images that made the front pages and made the position of the Yorks' marriage impossible to sustain in public. Within 2 months, in March 1992, Andrew and Sarah announced their separation, and then, that August, came the photographs that turned the Duchess of York from a figure of sympathy into a figure of farce, and that have never quite been forgotten. Sarah was on holiday at a villa in the south of France with a different American, a financial advisor named John Bryan, and a long lens caught them by the pool, and the images that ran in the British press of the Duchess topless and Bryan apparently kissing her feet, her toes in his mouth, were so spectacularly undignified that they became a permanent part of the national folklore. The toe-sucking photographs were published while Sarah was actually staying at Balmoral with the rest of the royal family, which meant that the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh and the assembled household opened their newspapers over breakfast to find the Duchess of York spread across the front pages in a state of undress with a man who was not her husband. It is difficult to imagine a more catastrophic morning. To understand the full weight of what was happening, you have to set it against the wider collapse that was engulfing the whole royal family at exactly the same time, because 1992 was the year the institution came closer to falling apart in public than it had at any point in living memory. The Queen herself, at the end of that year, would describe it in a phrase that has never been forgotten, calling it an annus horribilis, a horrible year, and she had reason. The marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales, Charles and Diana, was disintegrating in the most public and most painful way, with a tell-all book and rival camps briefing the press against one another. The marriage of the Duke and Duchess of York, Andrew and Sarah, formally separated that spring. The Princess Royal Anne divorced, and in November, as if to provide a literal image of the institution in flames, a great fire tore through Windsor Castle itself, the family's ancient seat, and the country watched the Queen's home burn on the evening news. It was, by any measure, the worst year the House of Windsor had endured in generations, a year in which the carefully maintained image of a serene and dignified royal family was comprehensively shredded, and a great deal of the shredding was being done by the younger generation's marriages, falling apart one after another in front of a press that could scarcely keep up with the supply of scandal. And into that maelstrom, the Ferguson family contributed more than its share. The toe-sucking photographs of August 1992 were, by common consent, the single most undignified image the entire crisis produced, the absolute nadir. The moment at which the Duchess of York passed permanently from the category of sympathetic figure into the category of national farce. A topless duchess and a financial advisor by a French swimming pool, his lips to her foot, the long lens catching every detail, and the whole thing splashed across the papers while she was a guest under the Queen's own roof at Balmoral. It is hard to overstate how badly it landed. Sarah, by her own later account, was effectively frozen out by the family in the aftermath, made to feel the full chill of an institution that had decided she was an embarrassment it could no longer afford. The cheerful redhead the country had embraced in 1986 was, by the end of 1992, a punchline and a pariah, her marriage over in all but the legal formalities, her standing inside the family destroyed. And here is where the father's troubles and the daughter's troubles compounded one another in a way that made the situation worse for both of them. Because Sarah, in the great crisis of her life, the collapse of her marriage and her standing, did not have in her father the kind of figure who could help her. A father with an unblemished reputation and the respect of the establishment might have been able to mediate, to counsel, to lend his daughter the shelter of his own good name. But Ronald Ferguson had no good name left to lend. He was himself a national joke. The man from the massage parlor, a figure the establishment had already cut loose, and his interventions on his daughter's behalf, sincere as they were, tended to make things worse rather than better, because a defense mounted by a discredited man discredits the thing it defends. The two of them, father and daughter, were drowning in the same press at the same time, in adjacent scandals with an overlapping cast, and far from being able to throw each other a rope, each one's disgrace simply added to the weight, pulling the other down. The Ferguson name, which had stood for something respectable a decade earlier, had become, by the early 1990s, a kind of byword for the whole undignified circus, and the Major and the Duchess wore it together. The reckless father and the reckless daughter, two of the leading players in the worst royal scandal of the age. When the Yorks finally divorced in 1996, 10 years almost to the season after the great wedding at Westminster Abbey, it closed a chapter that had begun in the brightest possible hope and ended in something close to ruin for everyone involved. Sarah emerged from it stripped of her place inside the working royal family, her finances in disarray, her reputation in pieces, though she would, in the long years that followed, show resilience that surprised many of the people who had written her off. And her father emerged from it as what he now permanently was, the discredited old Major, the cautionary tale, the man whose own recklessness had run in parallel with his daughter's for a decade, and had helped in its way to drag the family he had been so proud to join through the longest and most humiliating stretch of its modern history. He had wanted, more than anything, to belong to that family. He had got his wish in 1986 in the most spectacular fashion, and the belonging had turned, within a few short years, into a shared disgrace. The Major and the Duchess, side by side on the front pages, the two of them learning together, in the hardest possible way, exactly how the institution treats those who become an embarrassment to it, and exactly how little the grandeur of a royal wedding counts for once the cameras have turned hostile. So consider, now, the full shape of what was happening to this one family across these few years, because it is genuinely without parallel. The father was conducting an obsessive affair with a younger woman who would write a tell-all. The daughter was conducting an affair with a Texan that would blow up her marriage, and then being photographed half-naked with a second American by a swimming pool, and the same small, interconnected cast of opportunists and hangers-on and chancers drifted between the two stories, so that the Major's mistress and the Duchess's lovers all turned up in the same paperback, like guests at the same disreputable party. The House of York, in the early 1990s, was not really functioning as a branch of the royal family at all. It was functioning as a tabloid production line, a reliable weekly supplier of scandal to a press that could scarcely believe its luck. And Ronald Ferguson was not standing on the sidelines watching the chaos engulf his daughter. He was generating his own portion of it, in parallel, with the same heedless appetite that had run through his entire life. What is almost touching in a bleak sort of way is how completely he seems to have failed to see his own contribution to the family's troubles. In the version of events that Ronald Ferguson carried around in his head, and that he would shortly commit to print, the disasters that befell the Yorks were the work of other people, of a cold and scheming establishment, of meddling courtiers and a hostile press, and his own role was that of the loyal, embattled father doing his best to protect his daughter from forces beyond his control. The possibility that he himself, with the Wigmore Club and the Leslie Player affair and the general aura of a man for whom no scandal was ever quite avoidable, had contributed to the atmosphere in which his daughter's life unraveled, does not appear to have crossed his mind even once. He was, to the end, the hero of his own story and the victim of everyone else's, and the gap between that self-image and the documentary record is one of the more remarkable features of the man. The affair with Leslie Player eventually burned itself out, as such things do, leaving wreckage behind it. Her book, when it came, did him no favors, painting a portrait of a man consumed by an infatuation he could not control, and the financial questions around the polo events hung in the air, without ever resolving into anything that could be proved or disproved. The Major's standing, already badly damaged by the massage parlor, took another blow. And his daughter's marriage, by the time the dust began to settle in the mid-1990s, was finished. Andrew and Sarah would divorce formally in 1996, 10 years after the great wedding at Westminster Abbey that had marked the high point of the entire family's fortunes. The fairy tale was over. The cheerful red-haired duchess the country had taken to its heart in 1986 had become, by 1996, a punchline, and her father had spent those same 10 years adding his own scandals to the pile rather than shielding her from the weight of them. It would be easy, looking at this stretch of his life, to render a simple and damning verdict, and the simple verdict would not be wrong, exactly. He was reckless to the point of self-destruction. He was incapable of the discretion that his position demanded. He conducted an affair with a woman decades younger than himself at the precise moment when his family could least afford another scandal, and he did it with the same blithe disregard for consequences that he had shown in the massage parlor and would show again. But the simple verdict misses something, and the something is the same thing that runs all the way through this story, which is that the very quality that made Ronald Ferguson a disaster was inseparable from the quality that made him, to many people who knew him, oddly likable. He was a man entirely without guile or calculation in his appetites. He did not scheme. He did not plot. He was not cold. He simply wanted what he wanted, in the moment that he wanted it, with the uncomplicated greed of a large child, and he reached out and took it without ever once pausing to consider what it might cost him or the people around him. It is not an admirable way to live. It caused enormous damage, most of all to the daughter he genuinely loved. But it was not the behavior of a wicked man. It was the behavior of a weak one, and weakness, unlike wickedness, is something most people recognize in themselves, which may be why the country, even at the height of his disgrace, could never quite bring itself to truly hate him. What is genuinely striking, looking back across the whole sorry decade, is how completely Ronald Ferguson failed to grasp his own part in the family's troubles. Because in 1994, with the Wigmore Club behind him and the Leslie Player affair freshly exposed, and his daughter's marriage in ruins, the Major did the single most Ronald Ferguson thing it is possible to imagine. He sat down and he wrote a book. The book was called The Galloping Major, My Life in Singular Times, published by Macmillan, and the spectacle of it is almost too perfect. Here was a man whose own conduct had humiliated the royal family, not once but repeatedly, who had been photographed slipping into a massage parlor, who had conducted an affair so badly that his mistress had beaten him into print with a tell-all of her own, and who was now turning around and pointing the finger of blame squarely at the royal household. His central charge in the book was aimed at the courtiers, the faceless senior staff of the palace that the press of the period liked to call the men in gray, and the accusation was that these men had deliberately set out to undermine his daughter's marriage. They had meddled where they had no business to meddle, he argued. They had blocked the reconciliation between Sarah and Andrew that might have saved the marriage. They had treated his daughter as an outsider and an inconvenience, and in doing so they had helped to drive her out. He cast himself, across the pages of his own autobiography, as the wronged and loyal father, the embattled defender of his child against a cold, scheming, institutional machine that had decided that she was surplus to requirements. There is something almost magnificent about the nerve of it, and it is worth sitting with the irony rather than letting it slide past, because the irony is the key that unlocks the whole man. Consider what he was actually doing. A serial philanderer, a man caught in a vice scandal, a man whose own indiscretions had twice brought the family he had married into onto the front pages, was publishing a book in which he lectured the royal household about its failures of loyalty and judgment, and complaining, with apparent sincerity, about other people interfering in his family's private affairs. The beam in his own eye seems never once to have troubled his view of the mote in everyone else's. He genuinely appears to have believed every word of it, to have seen himself as the victim and the defender, the one decent and straightforward man surrounded by cold and calculating courtiers. And the gap between that self-portrait and the plain facts of his own conduct is so wide that you could drive a coach and horses through it, which is roughly what the reviewers did when the book appeared. But the deepest irony of the memoir, the one that places Ronald Ferguson squarely alongside every other figure the royal household ever came to despise, is not the hypocrisy of its content. It is the simple fact of its existence. Because the one thing the institution asks of everyone who comes near it, the single unbreakable rule of the whole enterprise, is silence. You do not write it down. You do not sell your story. You do not, under any circumstances, take the intimacy and the access and the trust that proximity to the crown has given you and convert it into a check from a publisher. The household's contempt for the people who broke that rule ran deeper than almost anything else in its emotional vocabulary, deeper than its contempt for scandal, deeper than its contempt for vulgarity. There was a word within the royal world for what staff did when they betrayed the family by talking for money. And it was the most damning thing that could be said of anyone. Ronald Ferguson broke that rule as comprehensively as anyone ever had. He took the family's secrets and his own grievances, and he put them in a book, with his name on the cover and his price on the back, and then, in the same volume, he had the gall to lecture the palace about discretion. And this is the thing that finally explains him, the single thread that runs through the entire noisy, undignified, oddly endearing mess of his life, from the massage parlor to the mistress to the memoir. Ronald Ferguson could not keep quiet. He could not keep quiet about his appetites, which is how the Wigmore Club happened. He could not keep quiet about his feelings, which is how the Leslie Player affair happened. An old man's infatuation conducted in the full glare of a press that was watching him precisely because he could be relied upon to do something foolish. He could not keep quiet about his grievances, which is how the book happened. He was, at the root of him, a man with no interior wall, no private compartment, no instinct whatsoever for the closed door, and he had been dropped by the accident of his daughter's marriage into the one family on the face of the earth that survives, generation after generation, by keeping every door closed and every secret behind it. He was the loudest man in the quietest house in the country. He was the single most indiscreet human being inside an institution built, from its foundations up, on discretion. And once you see that, the wonder is not that his association with the royal family ended in a series of scandals. The wonder is that anyone ever imagined it could end any other way. There is a comparison worth drawing here, because it sharpens the point. The royal family has always had a particular horror of the insider who talks, and the great cautionary tale within the household, the name used for decades to frighten new staff into silence, belonged to a governess who, long before Ferguson's time, had written a fond and largely harmless book about the royal children she had helped to raise, and had been cast into a lifetime of exile for it, cut off completely, never spoken to again. The lesson the household drew from that episode, and taught to everyone who came after, was absolute. You do not write the book, you take what you have seen to the grave. Ronald Ferguson, who moved in that world for decades and surely knew the lesson as well as anyone, wrote the book anyway. He could not conceive of taking anything to the grave in silence. Silence was simply not in his nature. He had spent his whole life as a man who needed to be seen, needed to be heard, needed to be at the center of the picture and the center of the conversation. And the idea of possessing a story and not telling it would have been, to him, a kind of slow death. So he told it. Of course he told it. He was constitutionally incapable of doing anything else. A quick word before we move into the final stretch of his story. If you have come this far, you clearly have a real taste for these things. So do subscribe and turn on notifications, and the next one will find you when it is ready. It genuinely makes a difference, and I am grateful to everyone who does. The book did not rehabilitate him. Books of that kind rarely do, because the public can generally tell the difference between a man setting the record straight and a man settling scores, and Ronald Ferguson was very obviously doing the latter. It sold, because anything with the word royal on the cover sold in the 1990s, and it gave the press another few weeks of material, and it deepened, rather than healed, the breach between the major and the institution he had spent his life trying to belong to. The men in gray, whatever they made of his accusations, were hardly likely to warm to a man who had just attacked them in print. And so by the middle of the 1990s, Ronald Ferguson had arrived at a strange and lonely place. He had lost his great royal job. He had lost his place at the prince's polo ground. His daughter's marriage was over. His own reputation was a national joke. He had alienated the household, exposed himself in the press, been written about by his own mistress, and written unwisely about everyone else. The man who had stood in Westminster Abbey less than a decade earlier as the proud father of a royal bride had managed, through a sustained campaign of his own recklessness, to turn the brightest chapter of his life into the wreckage of its longest and most humiliating one. And yet he was not finished, and the part of his life that remained turned out to contain something nobody watching the scandals of the late 1980s and early 1990s could possibly have predicted. Because the final act of Ronald Ferguson's story is not about appetite or vanity or scandal at all. It is about illness, and about the strange late genuine good that a foolish man can sometimes do almost in spite of himself, and it is the part of the story that, in the end, complicates every easy judgment you might have been tempted to make about him along the way. In 1996, Ronald Ferguson was diagnosed with prostate cancer. He would also, over the years that followed, develop skin cancer, and he would spend the last 7 years of his life living with the disease. Through courses of radiotherapy and a fragile, hard one all clear that arrived around 1998 and never quite became permanent, and the long, low shadow of recurrence that hangs over everyone who has once been told they have it. He was in his mid-60s when the diagnosis came, a man whose body had carried him through 4 decades of hard polo and a lifetime of vigorous, outdoor, physical living, and now that body had turned against him in the quiet, internal, undramatic way that cancer does. And the man who had been, for most of his life, a byword for self-indulgence, a creature of appetite and vanity who had thought first and almost only of himself, did something with his illness that was genuinely, unarguably, and rather movingly good. He went public. He used what remained of his fame, the battered, scandal-stained fame he had earned the hard way through 2 decades of front-page humiliation, and he turned it toward a purpose. He began to talk openly about prostate cancer, at a time when men of his generation and his class simply did not talk about such things, when the whole subject was wrapped in embarrassment and silence, and a stiff upper-lipped refusal to discuss anything below the waist, and when the direct and measurable consequence of that silence was that men died who might have lived, because they were too proud or too frightened or too uninformed to go to a doctor and ask a simple question. Ronald Ferguson stood up and told men to get themselves tested. He spoke about his own diagnosis, his own treatment, his own fear in plain language to anyone who would listen. He turned his own aging, ailing body into a public service announcement. And in doing so, he almost certainly saved lives, real men, somewhere in the country, who heard the Galloping Major talking about a thing nobody else would talk about, and who thought, well, if a bluff old cavalry officer and polo player can stand up and discuss it, perhaps I can stop being a coward about it, and who went to their own doctors and were tested, and some of whom, by the simple arithmetic of early detection, caught the thing in time because a foolish old man with a massage parlor scandal in his past had decided that this at last was a thing worth being indiscreet about. There is a deep and rather beautiful irony in that, and it is worth naming clearly, because it redeems, a little, the quality that had ruined him. The very thing that had been his undoing, the constitutional inability to keep quiet, the bottomless need to talk, to be seen, to put himself forward, to say the thing that other people kept private, was, at the very end of his life, turned to a use that was entirely good. He could not keep quiet about his appetites, and it destroyed his reputation. He could not keep quiet about his illness, and it may have saved the lives of men he never met. The same trait, the same incorrigible, oversharing, attention-seeking openness produced the worst chapters of his life, and then, in its closing pages, produced the best one. Most people's strengths and weaknesses are tangled together like that, 2 faces of a single coin, and few lives illustrate the truth of it more plainly than the life of Ronald Ferguson. The man who shut himself in a cocoon to think, and the man who stood up in public to tell frightened strangers to save their own lives, were the same man, and the thing that made him both was that he could never, under any circumstances, simply stay silent. His other rare public appearances in these late years were made for the only cause that ever mattered to him as much as his own standing, which was the defense of his daughter. Whatever his failures as a guardian of her reputation, and they were many, and they were public, he loved Sarah, fiercely and clumsily and to the last. When the press came after her, as the press came after her again and again across the 1990s and beyond, the Major could be relied upon to lumber into view and defend her, to tell the reporters they were being unfair, to insist that his girl was a good woman who had been treated badly. It was not always wise, and it did not always help, because Ronald Ferguson's intervention in any controversy tended to add heat rather than light, and a defense mounted by a man who was himself a national punchline was not always the defense a person most wanted. But it was sincere. The love underneath it was real. Of all the things that can be said against him, and there are a great many, it cannot be said that he was ever, for one moment, indifferent to his daughter. He simply expressed his devotion in the same way he expressed everything else, loudly, publicly, and frequently to her embarrassment. The bond between Ronald Ferguson and Sarah is, in the end, the most human thing in the whole story, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms, because it explains a good deal about both of them. They were, the two of them, remarkably alike, and the likeness was not a flattering one, but it was a real one. Both were warm, impulsive, big-hearted, and hopeless at caution. Both had a bottomless appetite for attention and affection, and a corresponding inability to see the trap until they were already standing in it. Both kept getting it spectacularly wrong, in public, in ways that handed the press an endless supply of material. And both had been shaped, at the root, by the same wound, because the woman who had walked out of that marriage in 1972 had been Sarah's mother as well as Ronald's wife, and the bolt to Argentina had left its mark on the 12-year-old girl, every bit as deeply as it had on the betrayed husband. They had survived that loss together, the father and the two daughters left behind at Dummer, and the surviving of it had bound Ronald and Sarah in a way that nothing in either of their chaotic later lives ever quite undid. So they defended each other. That is the thing to hold on to. When the press came for the Major over the massage parlor, it was his family who closed around him, and when the press came for Sarah, again and again, over the Texan and the financial advisor and the photographs and everything that came after, it was her father who lumbered into view to tell the reporters they were being unfair to his girl. Neither defense was ever very effective, because each of them was, by then, too compromised to be a credible character witness for the other, and a scandal-stained father defending a scandal-stained daughter tends only to remind everyone of both scandals at once. But effectiveness was never the point. The point was the loyalty itself, the simple, stubborn, unstrategic refusal of two flawed people to abandon one another, no matter how badly either of them behaved or how much easier it would have been, at times, to keep a careful distance. Sarah, for her part, spoke of her father with love to the end of his life and beyond it, and whatever exasperation he must sometimes have caused her, whatever fresh humiliation he kept dragging across her path, she never disowned him, never distanced herself, never did the calculating thing that a more careful person in her position might have done. She stood by him as he stood by her, the two of them lashed together through every storm, two people who could not stop getting it wrong, and could not stop loving each other either. There is something almost redemptive in that, set against the wreckage of everything else, because loyalty is not nothing, and a great many people who never embarrass anybody also never love anybody the way these two flawed, foolish, warm-hearted people loved each other. The Major failed his daughter in 100 public ways. He humiliated her with his scandals at the worst moments of her life. He was a liability to her standing, a fresh source of headlines when she least needed them, a man whose own recklessness ran in parallel with hers and made both of their situations worse. But he never once stopped being on her side. He never once treated her the way the institution treated her, as a problem to be managed and then discarded. To him, she was always simply his girl, the daughter he had raised after her mother left, the child he had walked down the aisle at Westminster Abbey, and his love for her was the one fixed and unwavering thing in a life otherwise governed by appetite and impulse, and the endless need to be at the center of attention. The family the Major had been so desperate to join measured belonging by the cold test of usefulness, and dropped him the moment he failed it. The Major measured belonging by blood and loyalty, and the bond of shared survival, and by that measure he never failed his daughter once. Of the two definitions of family, his was the more foolish and the more dangerous, and the one that kept ending up on the front pages. It was also, when you set the two side by side, unmistakably the warmer one. The late years brought losses as well as illness, and one of them reached back across a quarter of a century to the great rupture of his life. In September 1998, his first wife, Susan, the woman who had walked out of the marriage and bolted to Argentina in 1972, was killed in a car crash there, on the roads near the ranch where she had built her second life. She was 61. Her second husband, Hector Barrantes, the Argentine polo player for whom she had given up her family, had himself died of cancer in 1990, and Susan had spent the years of her widowhood struggling, selling off much of the great ranch at El Pucará to keep going, before her own life ended suddenly on an Argentine road. When the news came, in the small hours of the morning, it was Sarah who took the telephone call from the farm, and Sarah who then had to make the hardest calls of her own life, to her sister, and to her father, and to the rest of the family. Ronald by then was an old and ailing man, 67 years old, living with cancer, and the death of the woman who had left him all those years before landed on him as one more weight in a life that had accumulated a great many of. There is a poignancy in the way the whole sprawling, much married, much scandalized clan absorbed that grief together, because it is a reminder of something the tabloids tended to obscure, which is that underneath the headlines these were real people, bound to one another by the ordinary ties of blood and history and shared loss, who picked up the telephone in the dark to break terrible news to one another the way any family does. Whatever had passed between Ronald and Susan in 1972, whatever bitterness and betrayal had ended their marriage, they had made 2 daughters together and shared the first half of their adult lives. And her death was not, to him, the death of a stranger. It was the closing of a door that had been standing ajar in some corner of his memory for 26 years. His own body, meanwhile, was failing by degrees. The cancer that had been pushed back in the late 1990s never fully released its grip, and in November 2002 he suffered a heart attack, the kind of warning that a man of 71 with a long history of illness does not often get to ignore for long. And it was around this time, in one of those small and quiet mercies that the institution occasionally extends to people it has previously cast out, that Ronald Ferguson was reinstated to the Guards Polo Club, quietly readmitted, shortly before the end, to the world from which the Wigmore Club had banished him 14 years earlier. It was not a grand gesture. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no public restoration of the prodigal. It was simply a door, reopened a crack after a very long time for a dying old man who had, before the disgrace, given the royal sporting world 2 decades of genuine and competent service. It did not undo anything. It did not erase the scandals or restore the lost grandeur. But it was a hand extended, however late, and after the long cold years it must have meant something to him to be let back in, even at the very end, even by the narrowest of margins, to the green world below Windsor Castle, where he had once stood at the prince's shoulder with his stopwatch, and felt for a while like the most important man on the field. By the start of 2003 then, the picture of his life was nearly complete, and it was a picture of strange and irreconcilable halves. He was an old man living with cancer and a failing heart, a man whose great royal role was long behind him, whose reputation had been comprehensively wrecked by his own hand, whose first wife was dead and whose daughter's marriage had ended in public disgrace. And he was also a man who had, in his final chapter, turned his own illness into a genuine public good, who had been quietly let back into the polo world he loved, who was still surrounded by the loyal second wife, who had refused for nearly 30 years to be driven off, and who could still, when he chose, summon the booming voice and the upright bearing and the bottomless self-assurance of the cavalry officer he had been at 20. The Galloping Major was nearly done, but the story still had its closing image to deliver, and the closing image, when it came, would say more about who he had really been, and about the institution he had spent his life circling, than all the scandals put together. Ronald Ferguson died on the 16th of March 2003 of a heart attack at the Hampshire Clinic in Basingstoke, a few miles from the farm at Dummer, where he had been raised and where he had lived his whole life. He was 71 years old. The cancer and the failing heart had caught up with him together, in the end, as they so often do, the long illness and the sudden event arriving at the same destination. The boy born in London in 1931 with the blood of a Stuart king in his veins, the cavalry officer, the polo manager, the single father, the serial offender, the most indiscreet man in the most discreet family in the country, came to the end of his long and noisy life quietly, in a clinic in the Hampshire countryside, not far from where it had begun. And the funeral, when it came, told the truth about his standing more eloquently than any of the obituaries that followed, because it answered the question that had hung over his entire life, which was whether, in the end, after everything, he had ever really been one of them. The funeral was small and private, a family affair held without fanfare, and among the few who came to bury him were the Prince of Wales, the future King Charles III, whose polo Ronald Ferguson had run for 21 years, and the Duke of York, Prince Andrew, his former son-in-law, the prince his daughter had married and divorced. Charles came, Andrew came. The 2 senior royal men whose lives had been bound up with the Majors, one through 2 decades of polo, and one through a marriage that had ended in disgrace, stood at the graveside of the man the palace had stepped away from in 1988. and left to deal with his troubles alone. There is a great deal contained in that small fact, and it repays a moment's thought. The institution that had withdrawn from him so coldly in the worst hour of his life, that had let it be known he would have to clean up his own mess, that had cut him loose from the prince's polo and the prince's club, and left him to twist in the wind of the Wigmore scandal, sent its men to his funeral 15 years later. It is the way the institution works, and it is worth understanding, because it is neither as cruel as it can look in the moment of withdrawal, nor as warm as it can look in the moment of return. The palace had cut him loose when he became a liability, because protecting the center always comes first, and it had said nothing in his defense when he most needed something said. And then, when he was dead and could embarrass no one any further, when the cost of association had fallen to zero, the same institution sent the Prince of Wales and the Duke of York to stand by his grave and see him off with honor. It was a kind of absolution, quiet and posthumous, and almost certainly more than he had any right to expect. The man who had spent his whole life desperate to be accepted by the royal family was, in the end, accepted by them, on the only day on which acceptance cost the family nothing at all. There is something in that which is sad, and something which is fitting, and the two are difficult to separate, which is true of almost everything about him. His widow, Susan Deptford, the woman who had stayed through every storm, who had held her ground through the massage parlor, and the mistress, and the books, and the lawsuits, and the long illness, survived him by many years. In 2012, she remarried to a distinguished general, and at the celebrations for that wedding were Prince Andrew, his former wife Sarah, and the two granddaughters Ronald did not live to see grow into adulthood, the princesses Beatrice and Eugenie. The family, in other words, went on, as families do, the chaos of the scandal years subsiding gradually into the ordinary business of a clan getting older, marrying, gathering, carrying on. And Ronald Ferguson passed into memory as one of the more colorful supporting characters in the long royal soap opera of the late 20th century, a man the public remembered, when it remembered him at all, with a kind of exasperated half-affection, as the polo-playing major who could not stay out of trouble. So what was he in the end? It is the question every honest account of a life has to attempt, and in his case the honest answer is that he was several contradictory things at the same time, which is, of course, the only kind of person there has ever been. The temptation with a man like Ronald Ferguson is to choose one of two simple stories and tell only that one. The first simple story is the affectionate obituary version, the lovable old buffer, the bluff cavalryman, the devoted polo grandee, whose appetites got the better of him from time to time, but whose heart was in the right place. The second simple story is the tabloid version, the shameless old goat, the serial adulterer, the vice club member and the chaser of younger women, the embarrassment who dragged the royal family through the mud and then had the cheek to blame everyone else. Both of those stories are true, and both of them are lies, because each one is only half of him, and the whole of him was both halves at once, held together in a single, contradictory, recognizably human life. He was reckless, genuinely and incurably so, a man who walked into a massage parlor scandal at the precise moment his family's fortunes had reached their peak, and then, before the lesson could so much as begin to land, walked into a second scandal with a woman young enough to be his daughter, and conducted that one in the full glare of a press that was watching him for exactly that reason. He was shameless in the most literal sense, which is to say that shame did not seem to stick to him, that he could be exposed and mocked and dropped by the palace and humiliated across the front pages and still surface a few years later writing his own tell-all and lecturing everyone else about loyalties and discretion. He was unfaithful, comprehensively and serially, throughout a first marriage that ended only when the wife he had repeatedly betrayed finally found, on a beach in Corfu, a better offer than the one she had at home. He was financially careless, the books always somehow difficult to follow, the questions never quite answered. He was vain and he was loud, and he possessed an almost heroic inability to understand his own part in any of the disasters he caused, casting himself always as the wronged man, the loyal man, the victim of other people's schemes, while the wreckage piled up around his own feet. The whole palace knew his secrets, every one of them, long before the newspapers did, and the palace kept its knowledge to itself for exactly as long as he remained useful, and not one single day longer. And he was also a single father who raised two daughters, more or less alone, after their mother walked out and crossed an ocean to start again without them. He was a genuinely gifted polo organizer, energetic and capable and devoted, who served the heir to the throne loyally and well for 2 decades, in a role he performed with real skill before he became too great an embarrassment to keep. He was a husband fortunate enough to find a second wife who refused to abandon him, and decent enough, in his rough way, to hold on to her for the rest of his life. And he was a man who, dying of cancer, took the wreckage of his own fame and turned it toward a use that was wholly and unambiguously good, standing up to tell frightened strangers to face the thing he was facing, and very probably saving lives in the process. The bath oil ended up in the massage parlor. The mistress wrote her book. The daughter he adored he also, again and again, humiliated, with a recklessness that never once paused to weigh the cost to her. But he loved her and he defended her, clumsily and counterproductively, and to the very end, against an institution that he understood correctly would never fully accept any of them, no matter how grand the wedding had been, or how high the daughter had climbed. He stood at the edge of the polo field with his stopwatch, telling the future King of England what to do. And he must have felt, in those years, that he had won, that the boy from the Hampshire farm with the king's blood in his veins had finally and completely arrived. What he never understood, what he was perhaps temperamentally incapable of understanding, was that there was never any arriving, not for a man like him, not in a family like that. The institution he had married his daughter into measured belonging by a single, simple, unforgiving test, which was the ability never, under any circumstances, to become a problem. And Ronald Ferguson was always going to be a problem. It was the most reliable thing about him, more reliable than the booming voice or the upright bearing or the regimental tie. He could no more stop being a problem than he could stop breathing, because being a problem was simply what happened when a man with no interior wall and a bottomless appetite for attention was let loose inside an institution built on silence. And when the problems came, as they always did, as they were always going to, the cocoon where he liked to shut himself away for an hour and think turned out to be the very last place on earth that could protect him. The truth about him, the truth the simple stories miss, is that the qualities people most disapproved of and the qualities people found most likable were not two separate sets of qualities at all. They were the same qualities, seen from different angles. The openness that made him indiscreet was the same openness that made him warm. The appetite that made him reckless was the same appetite that made him alive, vivid, fun to be around, a man who filled a room. The need to be seen that made him vain was the same need that, at the end, made him stand up and speak about his illness when other men stayed silent and died. The lack of a private wall that destroyed his reputation was the lack of a private wall that, in his final years, saved the lives of strangers. You cannot have the one without the other. They came as a package, the way they do in most people, except that in Ronald Ferguson, the package was larger than life, louder than life, and lived out in front of a watching nation that found him, by turns ridiculous and appalling, and somehow against its own better judgment rather hard to dislike. He was the Galloping Major. He was the man behind the palace gates, whose secrets the palace would have much preferred to keep quiet, and could not, because keeping quiet was the one thing in his entire long, loud, ridiculous, and finally, rather human life that Ronald Ferguson was never, ever able to do. He talked about everything. He hid nothing, not his appetites, not his grievances, not his illness, not his love for his daughter, not his bottomless need to be at the center of every story. In a world that ran on discretion, he was the man who could not stop talking, and it cost him almost everything, and then, right at the very end, the same incurable openness gave something genuinely good back to the world, which is about as much redemption as most of us can hope for. He was reckless, he was shameless, and the whole palace knew. They knew it all, from the very beginning, and they let it ride for as long as it suited them, and then they let him fall, and then, When he was safely beyond doing any more damage, they came to bury him with honor. That was the bargain in the end that the Galloping Major struck with the family he gave his daughter to. He never quite understood its terms, but he lived inside it, loudly and recklessly, and without a moment's silence, until the day the doors of the Hampshire clinic closed on him for the last time. 2 years short of nothing in particular, a long way from the throne he had spent his whole life riding toward, and not so very far at all from the Hampshire field where he had first learned to sit a horse and look the part. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, the videos on screen now have been picked out just for you, and I think you will really like them. And if you have not already, do subscribe before you go, so the next one finds you when it is ready. I will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.